Hi, scholars. This completes our set of readings that on material that I wrote, and we're going to move into Stephen Shapin's Scientific Revolution, a very good little book, and look at what is this scientific revolution, you know. But first, we want to deal with Descartes today, the sort of birth of modern philosophy. This Descartes often sort of considered a father or one of the fathers or founder of modern philosophy, largely because which leads into this Enlightenment term that we've got here. Descartes died in 1650, so right in the middle of the 17th century. And he died, he had to flee France and went to the Dutch republics. And the Dutch republics were places where just a lot of really intellectually vital life was going on. But heavily Protestant, but also allowing a lot of other things going on. So a lot of freedom of the intellectual life. And so the Dutch republics play a crucial role in European intellectual history, especially in the 17th century. And Descartes there, he's being taken care of. He's been supported by the royal house, and he becomes this great thinker. Now, he's most famous for what we all, I think, therefore I am. This is the cogito. Well, let me get this looking right here. Cogito, ergo sum. This is just a famous line. And this is sort of the beginnings of modern philosophy. And the reason it's always looked back upon for this is not because, and this is what we're reading about today, it's not because of what Descartes actually said or what he thought. It's because of this. There's a sort of dynamism to this notion in the Enlightenment and in the modern world and Romanticism. And you combine Romantic and Enlightenment and you have basically our modern world. And it's all about the me. It's all about the I. It's a I think. And this is where we've talked about this term humanism. And this is where humanism goes wacky. Because humanistic thought was a collective thought, a curricular thought, an educational thought, a value system in which we fellowship together in thought. We think and we understand our relationship as humans to each other and humans to God and humans to society. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, humanism. But this becomes humanism, which is me, which is I, which is, I think, therefore I am. And so, every dang, sophomore philosophy major thinks that he can sort of decide for himself what the cosmos is. This is crazy. I'm not a big fan of philosophy in this way. Philosophers have to be taught very carefully, because, especially in philosophy majors, because this I-ness of it can really send people into crazy directions. Now, one of the things that I would like to bring up to you that this article is important for, and why I'm having you is there's a difference between history of philosophy, we've talked about this, and intellectual history. Intellectual history is about how things worked out, how people think, how actually things go, and how do people learn logic at Harvard, that kind of thing. What were the effects of Descartes' thought on Europeans? History of philosophy is often taught and is often done as a type of here's what Aquinas said, here's what Descartes said, here's what Locke said, here's what I think, and it's like that you bounce from and it's not even often built on primary sources. It's what Descartes meant to say, what Aquinas was actually sort of pushing toward, not what he actually said. And then what Locke it means. I'm a very frustrated person with history philosophy. One of the beautiful things about going to college is you find that professors, we don't all think alike, and we don't all agree with each other. And whole disciplines are built in not in opposition to each other, but in a dialectic with each other, with a back and forth discussion. In history of philosophy, we historians over in history departments tend to think philosophers do history in a wacky way. We also think that scientists do history of science in a very wacky way. Tends to all lead to, in a progressive matter to me, in the end. Whereas a history of intellectual life, history of thought, is always more about like what's this all look like on the ground, okay? And so my article here, and what I've always loved to write about and think about is what does thought look like on the ground, especially when you realize how deeply intellectual the Christian life is, and especially the Christian community has always supported two great things that I love. Music and philosophy are highly supported by the Christian community, and so this is the greatest Christian community in my mind that ever sort of really existed, is Puritan New England, in the sense of just like being fascinating. This highly intellectual, the highest concentration of college graduates in any place in the world is in Puritan New England in the 17th century. And fascinating people, men and women, bright, intellectual, thinking, reading, doing good stuff. Okay, so the big issue here, and I'd just like to point this out, is that Puritanism picks up on what Descartes actually does, which is the I think, therefore I am, only works because Descartes says, okay, what is consciousness in my mind must be true. And it must be true. And the reason it must be true is that there's a good God. A God who does not deceive. Okay? So you've got Descartes even says that everything falls apart. All knowledge, all world, all intellectual life, everything falls apart if you've actually got a malicious divine character out there, the God who sort of just wants to play with our brains, who wants to make us think this is this notion of common sense that will later develop out of the Scottish especially is that, hey, we got a good God out there who gives us good information, good communication. We're not being just sort of manipulated by some deceitful God. So Descartes can be sure that I think, therefore I am, only because there's a good God who validates the knowledge of his consciousness. Okay, so this is an epistemological foundation. And we've always found that to get to the epistemology, how do we know what we know? This is like where intellectual life really becomes interesting. And then later, but one of the things we're going to find out in the scientific revolution and on into our modern world, there's been a movement to sort of like, let's not think about epistemology. Let's not worry about how we know what we know or what the purpose of things are. Let's not think deeply. Let's actually think a little more superficially and reduce our thinking rather than sort of be expansive thinkers. And so we'll talk about that later. But so what we have is this emphasis on epistemology. And of course, if you're going to get into emphasis on epistemology, then of course it's the will. This is what Descartes is in cahoots with Augustine, It's the intellect and the will that work together. And if you want to be a skeptic, skepticism for Descartes is and all these other people we're talking about is a type of defective will. You've got something wrong. You're lazy. You maybe don't have grace even. There's something wrong with your will if you can't sort of like see what should be seen, what the earth and the cosmos is trying to. All creation calls out, and this is like Paul. He's like something's wrong. All men are sinners. All people are sinners. All people have something deceiving them, but some people have become completely deceived and allow themselves to deceive and sort of wallow in being deceived. And those people have lost the will to know. Okay, so let's get to my little article here, and I just want to run quickly through it. You will not be, of course, tested all the intricacies of this, but you can see how ideas come to earth, cross the Atlantic over to this little provincial college at Harvard. Here's William Brattle. He's the hero of the story. He is a much-loved tutor, and I've sort of spent my life trying to imitate him. Now, if you notice in my office, we have a picture of Harvard right above in actually the early 18th century, right above my desk. All right, so he writes these logic textbooks. All right. And, these footnotes are all they're good. But here's this article proposes, okay, this is where I give my theme and plan, that alliance between Puritanism and Descartes existed. Okay, there's my theme. And it's served to strengthen Puritanism's intellectual hegemony. This article will first explain it's going to do this, and then it's going to, I should just read it, I guess. First, explain how Cartesian logic, having already been formed a system compatible with Augustinian epistemological principles, useful to the came to be taught at the provincial college. More importantly, this article will then explain how Brattle used it to strengthen rather than diminish the Harvard commitment to Christian orthodoxy. And what I propose is that I'm offering here a very different interpretation of Cartesian, because you read most histories at this time, I wrote this back in the 80s, would always say that, the Descartes introduction of Cartesian logic is the decline of Puritanism. And I'm saying, this is actually, it's part of a recognition that there's a much more complicated world, and it's actually a strengthening of Puritanism in the beginning, in the midst of it. So I talk again about the Port Royal logic, which we've gone to Arnaud, and I talked about Arnaud. A sidelight to this was the writing of that Arnaud article about the mathematics. And Arnaud is this key figure, but dang it, of course, there's this other guy, Legrand, who works with Arnaud, and then Brattle is going to basically copy and paste together these logic textbooks of his out of these guys, okay? And what Arnaud, if he's the key sort of Cartesian, is that Arnaud is this guy who really is anxious to build stability in an Augustinian way for the intellectual life in the late 17th century. And so he's a great hero. I love Arnaud and all of his stuff. And so the dissenting academies were like these little schools that Arnaud created. And the most interesting dissenting academy of them all is Harvard, across the Atlantic. And so there's a bunch of textbooks written by, there's just a small little place, like, they're not even any professors. There's just these 3 tutors plus actually just 2 tutors, Brattle and Leverett, plus President Increase Mather, Cotton Mather's dad. These Brattle and Leverett are about the same age as Cotton Mather, just a couple years older, I think. No, they are the same age as Mather. So it goes on, and I'm sure you'll think it's tedious, and it is tedious. But it's beautiful. I had a good time writing this article. It took me a long time to put it all together, just like you're working on your papers, to put these footnotes together, these quotes together, to create a strong argument, okay? And then, we get down into the discussion of epistemology and how that's going to support the Puritan ideas, and However, Cartesian law's great assistance to Puritanism was combining logic with an epistemology that put logic into a similar intellectual category as theology, that both depend upon a God who revealed knowledge to humanity. And so in other works and in my books and stuff, I dealt with ways that that really does work out. And this notion of geometrical demonstration, we're going to get to that. Descartes is very important for bringing in building certainty in a geometrical form, a geometrical method. We'll talk more about that when we get into the science and science stuff next week. But this is a good article here, and so it comes down to the question at the end of whether what was the role of Locke later on, and where how these lasted on until the 1730s, and so it's from 1687 to at least 1735. There's a logic textbook teaching Cartesian logic in Harvard, and that is very strong, very not just the sort of passing phase before Locke comes in, and we'll talk about Locke later, but yeah, I like this, and I hope you appreciate it, but remember that don't get bogged down by it, don't get frustrated by it, and certainly we will work together for a final that's fair and everything like that, so you don't have to to feel like you're memorizing these crazy things.